Hi everyone, and a warm welcome to Tomorrow's Tech Today, bringing you the latest in technology, talent, transformational change, and of course, tech as a force for good. I'm your host, Senator Sally Eaves, and today our focus is on empowering ransomware protection and cyber resilience in the age of GenAI with Commvault, or in other words, ensuring readiness is within reach for organizations of any size. This is a deep dive right across the many changes impacting data vulnerability from both a cybersecurity and data management lens, and with a special focus on recovery, skills, culture, and both the challenges and opportunities of AI, GenAI, and LLM models. And look out too for breaking news on Commvault Cleanroom, which is comprehensively bringing together testing, forensics, and data recovery all in one place. So to learn more, I'm delighted to be joined now by Thomas Bryant, Director of Product Marketing at Commvault. Fantastic. So without further ado, a warm welcome to the show, Thomas. Fantastic to have you with me today.
Thank you. It's so great to be here.
Oh, fantastic. And I always do this to start off. Perhaps just if we could just spend a moment or two just introducing yourself and your role at Commvault.
Sure. Hello, everybody. My name is Thomas Bryant. I'm one of the directors of product marketing here at Commvault. So my main mission is to help spread the word about all the great things that we're doing here at Commvault, but also to take it to that next step. We do a lot with technical marketing and actually producing content, demos and videos and things like that as well. And talking to wonderful folks like yourself when I get the opportunity.
Oh, fantastic. I love it too, Thomas. Brilliant. And I think that education piece and sharing examples of what can be done, I think is so important, particularly when we're looking at the subject we are today. So brilliant stuff. Thank you for taking a moment to do that. And let's dive right into it. I thought maybe one way to do that is go a little bit macro to micro, if I will, and just look at kind of the vectors of change that are happening right now. And if we look at it probably in two different areas, we've got, well, in terms of data, the volume, the value just goes up and up, doesn't it? But so does the vulnerability at the same time from two main areas I see. One, kind of data management, and the second one from cybersecurity stance. And on top of that, the threats themselves, the scope, the scale, the sophistication, the collaboration, and the diversification and approach. We could go on and on, couldn't we? So perhaps to start it off from your take, what are you seeing in terms of kind of what's changed the most?
Well, to your point, there's a lot of things that are going on in the market today. And, starting with like data management, every time that somebody comes out with a new estimate of how much data we're going to have, we continue to blow it out of the water in terms of it's just exponentially getting bigger and bigger. And protecting that data, securing that data is becoming increasingly hard. When I was a backup admin many moons ago, we had a very finite time that we could protect data, and that window is shrinking increasingly. And so we're having to do more with less time, with less resources. And so just being able to protect that data from like backup and recovery standpoints is increasingly difficult. And we don't even know necessarily, like, do we need to protect it all? Right. I mean, there's that, like, if I look at my laptop, sometimes I wonder, like, do I really need to keep this and apply that same thought process to enterprises? It's daunting, especially when people come and go. And then that also presents another area in terms of vulnerabilities, because if there's all that data out there and threat actors get in, one, they can exfiltrate it. And then number two, they can encrypt it. And you don't necessarily know, which data do I really care about? Is all my critical data secured? Is everything secured? Should it be secured? So there's like the term ROT, like redundant, obsolete, and trivial data. I think that's an interesting area that companies don't spend enough time kind of doing some of that housekeeping work. And that can then lead to, like you mentioned, security threats, and they're just coming faster and faster.
So true. And I think you were talking about, previous roles there. Thinking back as well to kind of roles as like in change management, which I led, and also from operational teams. I think we're also seeing, challenges around overload too. That's coming up for me in terms of, alert fatigue, but also just as you're saying with the cost pressures, resource pressures too. That is another area, and it's adding to kind of that keyword complexity, I think, as well. And certainly governance right up there, I think, is a growing area where that education piece we mentioned right at the top so important to kind of cut through some of the information that's out there and kind of get what's underneath it and what really matters to you and your organization, what you shouldn't necessarily need to be doing, if you see what I mean. So yeah, love those points, Thomas. That's great.
Yeah.
And kind of drilling into that a little bit more, again, that word cyber resilience, we're seeing it a lot now. I think it's super
Mhm.
important, particularly when we look at the different levels of risk, but also the different opportunities we have right now. So perhaps to start this off, for your take, what does cyber resilience mean for you at Commvault?
Yeah, I mean, I think cyber resilience, to your point, could mean a lot for a lot of different people. But when I think about it in the context of Commvault, cyber resilience is really about being able to be resilient in recovery of when an action happens. So if it's a security incident and a threat actor comes in and they encrypt all your data, how do you recover from that? And part of that is getting the data back, but just how do you get your business back running? Are you prepared for that? And I use the analogy of like disaster recovery. We've been doing that for decades, longer than I've been around, probably. Uh, and we understand that. And it's easy to deal with disaster recovery because you're working under a certain set of premises in terms of I expect the data is clean. I can go from site one to site two, and I can kind of flip some switches, and that's pretty well understood. But what happens when you can't trust that data? And so for us, what we see is a lot of the security folks are shifting right to under in like in the NIST model, especially where they're starting to realize they need to do more in terms of helping the business recover. And the folks that have traditionally done recovery, IT folks like myself, we're starting to shift left because we're starting to realize we have all this data. There's other things we can do with that data. And we also need to be mindful and wear multiple hats, knowing that part of our job should also be to help security and make sure that we minimize any threats. And so to me, that's kind of like what resilience is it's the full life cycle of data. And I think the one piece, just to throw one last piece on the answer, I think one of the things that's most critical nowadays when we talk about cyber resilience is that idea of testing. We've done DR testing for so long, but when it comes to cyber resilience and threat actors and security issues, we are not testing enough, and we need to do more to help customers be able to test and make that frictionless because it's hard, especially with applications being in the cloud or hybrid, right? You might have a mainframe in the basement connecting to a web service in AWS with a bunch of load servers and Lambda functions. It's really hard to test some of that in DR, let alone a cyber attack.
Absolutely. I think when we see what's happening with kind of reimagination of older threats as well, I think it makes that testing imperative ever more essential. I think it really does. I mean, we've seen things going back to the 70s. I used to work in telco, and we're seeing like older protocols there reimagined, shall we say, as a route into crypto wallets, as a mutive attack. So that's one example there. But also in other areas too, we're seeing kind of bad actors collaborate together. And some of the
Mm.
weaknesses I've seen there, again, you look at the multiple different organizations that are involved, so much added complexity. It's difficult to test, but the imperative ever more rises with the different sophistication and different variation and approach we're seeing. So I think it's a great example. And again, emphasizing that coming together around some of this too. So it's a brilliant point. And just kind of reflecting back on COVID a little bit as well, one of the areas that I think got overlooked a lot was areas like patching and some of these
Mhm.
really absolute imperative foundational behaviors, whether it's kind of keeping up your patching up to date, but same thing with testing. I think areas we
Mm.
just need a massive more focus on. So I think what you announced around this is absolutely key, Thomas. I'd love to dive into that a little bit later on as well, if I may.
Yeah.
Um, but perhaps as a next piece, I'd love to bring in a little bit more about that collaboration piece and how you're working and supporting organisations of all different sizes dealing with the kind of dynamism of this landscape we're talking about today. So, what are you seeing, from partners or customer perspectives, in need of support, but also kind of appetite for innovation in this space as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is a big appetite, but there's also a big skills gap there. I mean, the security folks and they like to stay in their kind of silo, and same with IT. A good friend of mine from VMware days, he used to call them cylinders of excellence because every silo is definitely fantastic. But the point is that we've worked in isolation for so long, and that's good in some senses. But when we start to think about security and cyber events now, we really have to start doing more collaboration. And so, what we tend to see a lot with customers, and one of the things I like to talk with customers about is how do we build the bridges between those silos, and how do we get people to understand, number one, we're not here to, tell you how to do your job better or worse. We want to help the company be better. And so I think this whole idea of cyber resilience is actually really good because it's helping build those bridges, and if nothing else, starting the conversation that needs to be had. And maybe there's some career longevity for folks too, which is never a bad thing, because there's just new opportunities, and there's these new roles that span security and IT and data management that are being created now, because people are realizing that there are these gaps between technologies, between different departments within IT. And I think that's a great thing, because it shows that there is a need, and that there's not enough people to fill it. So they're looking for people and process and tools to address that.
I love that. And as a little side note, think I'll take out for a separate kind of non-profit series. What a great advert you were just saying there. I think in many ways, Thomas, for what a place to work in terms
Yeah.
of the different types of roles you can be involved in, the different skills that make a difference, and kind of the dynamism of change as well. So I love that. And also when we look at skills gaps, I think if we're looking at bringing in different skills across IT and business, for example, and that longevity you mentioned, what a great example there for bringing in kind of reverse mentoring and things like that
Yeah.
as we're onboarding new people in and bringing those skills together. So I think, that rise of the generalist I sometimes talk about is really relevant here, having like a particular discipline of excellence, but that broader kind of canvas of toolbox, of skills to work with too. And I think that could be an
Yeah.
interesting way of doing that.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
Yeah,
Brilliant.
it's an interesting space. There's so much change that's happening. I mean, even so, like back to an earlier point, right around testing. I mean, it presents new opportunities for folks to really understand what are your applications. I mean, when I was a VMware vSphere admin, I mean, I knew that I was building workloads, but what were they used for? What were all the things that they were connected to? There was like a handoff to a separate team that managed the application, and then that got handed off to the backup team. And I think this is a great opportunity for folks to really understand more in depth how are their businesses running, and that will help them be able to plan and test and then secure what they've got in their environment. So in my mind, knowledge is key, right? And having information about that is critical for what we're trying to achieve.
Absolutely, that depth of understanding, isn't it? And again, from a kind of challenge, but also an opportunity point of view, just reflecting back on kind of what people are asking me about a lot at the moment, I definitely still mention compliance up there. Whether it's NIS2, for example, or DORA or CI,
Yeah.
could go on and on, couldn't you, if you see what I mean? But I think there's a big shift here. Towards more, say, proactive risk management, but also more personal accountability. That goes kind of right across C-suite. So again, I think that's another way where there can be a challenge and there can be some confusion here. Where's the duplication across legislation, for example? But equally,
Yeah.
with that depth of understanding, etc., as a way to kind of
Yeah.
support that new kind of growth in roles and things as well. So I think so much here, and again, mindset so important in terms of how to navigate this the right way. I think so. Brilliant stuff, Thomas. Thank you. Just wanted to bring that a little bit in there as well,
Yeah.
and it leads me on to AI in a little bit more depth as well. And I think another one here in terms of how we can look at this in two different ways. I think we see double-edged sword, don't we, a lot used in AI and its very variants, particularly in
Mm.
terms of security. So from that perspective, what's your kind of let's dive in that from kind of both takes. But what are you seeing the most here? And perhaps one example that I'm seeing a lot on, and you had a piece on this recently, but around, for example, how generative AI is kind of catalyzing innovation and new sophistication, say in ransomware, just as a starter for tech.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, we're seeing the goods and the bads of AI as it's coming to market, and people are discovering what kind of capabilities they can leverage AI for. On the bad side, you've got AI for hire. We've had ransomware groups that have been selling their services for years, and now they're bringing these kind of bad AI capabilities to where we've got these polymorphic attacks. They start off one way and they change and they shift, and they change their attack vector to try to avoid some of the traditional things like what we've been doing for in the industry with like Yara rules, right? So we need new sorts of capabilities that can find those sorts of attacks and be able to weed that sort of piece out. But then we also have the good side that has risk too, because as companies are starting to take on more AI, whether it's generative AI or specific pieces in there, what like LLMs or RAG models, whatever it may be, they're throwing big amounts of data into these big data lakes. And kind of like to your point earlier about compliance, is that data, is there personal PII data in there? Is it compliant with things like HIPAA? Is there PCI data and sensitive information that's going into these data lakes that AI is then feeding off of? Because we don't want that data to get out necessarily. There's lots of compliance issues there. But then at the same time, how do we even protect our data lakes, right? We need to be able to protect that data and secure it and be able to recover it in the case of those attacks. So I think there's a lot of good and bad with AI. One of the unique things we're doing with AI within Commvault is we're using it to help reduce the barriers for customers to get more value or added value within the platform. Whether it's a new user that comes on board, I mean, the last thing anybody ever does, it seems these days, is read the manual, right? Nobody reads manuals. Nobody likes to go through docs. So having an interface, we call it ARLI for autonomous resilience. And what ARLI, our Copilot, does is it allows customers to ask natural language and say, hey, how do I do X, Y, or Z? Hey, I would like to do this function. Could you walk me through it? And being able to leverage AI in a good way, right, can help speed up onboarding for new employees and folks that are using the tools. But then we can also take it a step farther, whether it's with things like troubleshooting. Like for us, we train it on our support tickets and knowledge bases and all our documentation. So if we see things that don't look quite right in an environment, we can make suggestions. And I think the other piece for AI is actually the other A, which is automation. So it's what can we do to help surface things and make it more intelligent and easier for you to consume, but also then actually do the action. Because all too often there's this, hey, AI will make recommendations and you have to go do all the clicks and all the things to do it. So I think good AI is here to stay. Bad AI is here to stay. And I think it's going to be an interesting battle between the two different sides of it. And that's one reason why we're also investing in the good AI kind of security pieces, like with Threat Scan Predict. And what we're doing there is we're actually we leverage AI models to look for these polymorphic attacks. And so when we see that there's something that looks kind of odd and it's changing shape and it's doing something different, that tells us, hey, there might be a problem there. And things like Threat Scan Predict help us, and things like ThreatWise, where we want to leverage these things to know sooner an attack. Because anything we can do to reduce the blast radius of an attack and get you recovered faster, that's really the big value to me is AI. It's not here to replace anybody's job. It's here to augment and make our jobs easier and faster and get to that like decision criteria just quicker.
Exactly. I think you mentioned that key word there, augmentation. It really is. It's not replacing. It's kind of complementary strengths in so many different ways. And I can put myself back into a role, as I mentioned, change management earlier, and just the benefit that would have had when I was doing that role in terms of ticket management, but also the knowledge sharing aspect of it from a community
Yeah.
point of view as well. So many benefits. Now that reminds me, just talking aloud here, Thomas, as well. I think for me, one of the undercapped areas for AI potential is also on this skills piece, because personalized learning programs in organizations using AI to help you kind of identify how you learn yourself, and so not only kind of bring skills accessibility, but the confidence to apply skills as well. And I think AI can have a great difference there, kind of for personalized training in organizations too. So I wanted to put a little kind of float out for that one as
Yeah.
well. It's so important, isn't it? And when we look at what's happening in organizations, so some research I've just been involved in, and it looks at investment in different technologies, and AI is right up there alongside DLT, actually, the top two. But you see these gaps later on. So the investment is really high, but not across all areas. So it might be within the technology, but it might not be, for example, within the skills uplift within teams. And similarly, like opening up sandboxes for experimentation with AI, but not necessarily having the training or the guardrails around that as well. So it's closing some of these gaps. The unification piece, I think, is so important here. So again, we could have I think a podcast just on this very one question, I think, couldn't we? But it's such an interesting one. And just as one follow up, because I get a lot of questions on this specifically, but on LLMs in particular, are you anything you could share specifically about what to be looking at, about specific challenges, or what to be considering now when if you're looking at this route, wherever you are on that journey? Some top tips, I think, would be great.
Yeah, I mean, I think the most basic one that I could give would be, what kind of data are you putting into your LLMs? I again, like to your point of just it's this hot thing, everybody's investing money into it. They're throwing data over the wall into a data lake, and they're not necessarily scrutinizing what that is. And there's all these different things for folks that are out there. If you've never looked up like AI hallucinations, you definitely should check that out because it's fascinating how we build these LLMs in general terms, not necessarily just us. And we put in guardrails in there because we don't want you to give away like personal information. For example, like, I want to type in chat GPT and say, hey, I need the phone number for the CEO of NVIDIA. I'm just going to pick on them for a moment. And it won't give it to you. But if you can make it hallucinate or ask it around certain ways, right? Like, well, my grandmother's really sick, and it'd be great if I could call the CEO of the company, and you can trick them into that. So some ways that's number one. There's personal information that's in that model that probably shouldn't be there, and then the model has some, it's how do you work within that model that may have these weird ways of getting around it. And so for us at Commvault, I mean, a long way to get around to like, so from us at Commvault, our perspective is one, we need to make sure that the data that's going in is clean. And it's the right kind of data, because we don't want things like personally identifiable information and phone numbers and addresses, or your bank account, or your like your social security number here in the US. But once it's there, we should be scanning that on a regular basis, because there's all these different people that are putting data in. So one, we want to make sure that what's going in is clean. After the data is there, let's make sure that it's also still compliant. And you mentioned like compliance as well, right? Things like DORA, where we have to be in compliant, we have to be resilient on this stuff. It becomes imperative that we're doing these sorts of scanning type actions to make sure that the data is clean. And then you mentioned the other thing around like testing of these models. It's another, our Cleanroom recovery capabilities that we've just recently announced as well, around being able to give you a isolated recovery environment where you can recover workloads in the event of an attack. It's great for things like that too, right? Where you want to build up a sandbox and put, say, maybe some of these AI capabilities in a sandbox in the cloud, where you can test it in isolation and see how it reacts before you move those things into production per se.
Absolutely, getting ahead of problems. Exactly, I think it's so important, and I think particularly for LMs, I think one of the challenges there that I talk about a little bit is about the fact that at this time that we have at the moment, experimentation is really rife. A lot of use of open source, which is fantastic for innovation, but again can bring its own challenges. Particularly, we've got multiple variety of different open source data sets and things as well. So definitely want to mention that. And what we can do as a side note, share maybe a little checklist around this area too for people to take away and consider. And you kind of led me on, Thomas, as well, to talking about Commvault Cleanroom a little bit more. And for me, kind of three main pillars there that we've brought in really naturally around testing, data recovery, but also forensics. I wonder if we could just spend a moment just drawing out those key kind of news for the audience as well.
Yeah, I mean, so when you're attacked, when you get an attack, a cyber attack, it's very different than DR. DR, you can make the assumption that the data is clean, and you just can turn some switches and run some automation, and it works. But in the case of a cyber attack, you don't know what's clean, so you have to assume that everything's been breached and all the data is suspect. And even things that are on-prem, you can't even assume that the hardware is clean anymore, right? There's all these attacks that come from state-sponsored attacks or organized cyber criminals now, where they infect the firmware or the BIOS of a machine. And so companies are realizing, one, it's going to cost them a fortune to stand up some sort of clean room on-prem, and so they're turning to other ways to take advantage or to mitigate that risk. And so Cleanroom Recovery, as part of Commvault Cloud, it's designed to allow you to essentially bring that data into an isolated environment in the cloud, recover it at the essentially limitless speed of the cloud, because cloud, it has so much more scale than anybody has on-prem, generally speaking, and be able to recover that data into that isolated environment, look at it. If you want to do forensics, you can perform forensics as well. But I almost look at forensics as a separate use case, because a lot of times what we've seen with attacks is, after you're attacked, your cyber insurance provider will come in and kind of say, okay, hang on, don't touch anything. We're going to look at things. So that takes a couple of days. And then the security folks want to be able to have it in an isolated environment and start to look at it, figure out what's clean. But at the same time, they also want to be able to run forensics to figure out, how did the bad actors get in? How did they do what they did to our data? And so we see the recovery piece happening sometimes in conjunction at the same time as different folks are looking at forensics. Well, again, like the cyber insurance folks, they're going to want to look at that for your claims. So there's definitely that need for both. The one, you've got to test rigorously, but then actually be able to scan that data, look for the threats, clean that data up, and then promote that into production, whether it's temporarily in the cloud, and then maybe later swing it back on-prem. But you've got to be able to get things back up and running as quickly as you can. And the cloud provides us a great capability there, and we built that in as part of what we're doing with Commvault Cloud Cleanroom Recovery.
Absolutely. And I would say as well, having a look at this, the by design features of this, I think, are super important. And you mentioned there about insurance. As a side note, again, I think what you're doing there will really support organizations with some of the growing gaps we see in cyber insurance. There's been a lot of focus, isn't there, on how clauses have been tightened. And I think a lot of organizations may have gaps in terms of not having the right recovery and other forms of protection in place right now. So I think what you're doing there will also help a lot of organizations around the cyber insurance and kind of warranties piece as well. So kind of a separate subject area maybe for another day. But as you were talking there, Thomas, I think it really supports that as well. And I know we don't have much time. It's kind of a rapid fire chat today, but I want to just spend a few moments as we finish this as well, maybe to look at some of the other vital elements of cyber resilience from a people and culture and skills perspective. And I saw one of your interviews a few weeks ago, and you were talking about kind of the joy really of technology, kind of bringing people together in different groups together as well to solve problems collaboratively. So to do that, I wonder if we could just trying to share a few kind of nuggets really about what a good culture kind of looks like for you to support that. And then maybe as a final one, we'll share a few skills ideas for people about what to look for, what to invest in kind of in yourself and your teams. But from culture first, maybe.
Yeah, I love that question. I think it's so important that, not just for like where we are in our career today, but I also look at it from like that mentorship perspective of like, what are the skills that I can help others learn or enable them to build that up. So when I think about what does good look like, I mean, good to me is open dialogue. Going back to that kind of silo comment I made a while ago, for far too long, IT's been in these silos, and we all kind of do our thing. And the reality is that ransomware and these threats, they live in the gaps in between those silos. And if we don't do a better job of communicating with our different counterparts in IT and in security, even within the business, we're doing ourselves a disservice. And that's a big problem because of all these threat actors coming in. Well, security makes the assumption that IT has got it. IT makes the assumption that security is doing their job. And that is all too often when we run into these problems. And I think part of that as well is getting security involved with more of these conversations on the IT side, that shifting right. It's hard because I tend to be a pretty trusting person, and I've had to learn to like, I can't trust it when somebody from the bank calls me, right? Because of like, I'm worried now about phishing attacks. And so I think some of that knowledge that like security has needs to make it over to IT in different groups. And same thing with IT, like this is what we do. This is how we do it. And people need to be open to the possibility of change. I love like the books like Who Moved My Cheese and things like the only thing that's constant in life is change. But like we have to get comfortable with the idea of other people are going to have a different perspective, and we need to be open to those ideas because it can make life a lot easier if we work together and assume positive intent. I know it's probably, that's a non-technical thing, but I think it's really important that we assume positive intent.
I
The
like
last thing
that.
you mentioned, like on the skills wise, I think that one's tough. I think there's a lot that folks need to go out and start to look at from an AI perspective. I think that's one. I think anybody that's in IT now should definitely pick up things like the ransomware playbook by Roger Grimes. Great example. We in IT, because I came from IT, like I was a help desk guy early in my career. I wish I would have started back then learning about securing systems and building things, because there is a lot of defense in depth when we build these systems deeper and we secure them at every layer. And so I think the biggest things for me skill wise are, one, learning more about security, two, learning about how to be receptive to change. And I would say probably three, and it's not, again, not technical, but I think just being open to those interpersonal relationships is so critical for bridging that gap and reducing the threats that you have out there. Because again, I know I said it already, but like the ransomware lives in those gaps between the teams and tools. So when you can bridge that gap and you can shrink it, it just makes your life so much easier.
I couldn't agree more. And I think what you just said there, that should be a T-shirt, I think, Thomas, that phrase. I think that's brilliant. Absolutely. I think that really does bring it to the fore. And for me, I just put a quick side note on that as well. That learning agility, I think you were talking about in many different ways there, because we always talk about kind of teams being agile or ambidextrous to change, or enterprises, for example. But that's also from a team and individual point of view as well, isn't it? So for me, it's learning agility, it's AI fluency, and it's also emotional intelligence and creativity, but perhaps bringing it all together and reflecting on what you were saying back in your earlier role, curiosity, and that ability to keep wanting to learn and unlearn too. I think, mindset play is really important here as well, and we can support people through that, through AI, but also through people means as well, if you see what I mean. So again, we'll share some resources for that as well. Brilliant, Thomas. I know we're out of time, so I want to say let's do this again very soon, because it'd be a pleasure to kind of pick a few more of those and deep dive into them further, wouldn't it?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me, Sally. I really
Oh,
appreciate your time.
Oh, it's my absolute pleasure. Thank you, Thomas, and thank you all for watching and listening in too. We'll be back with another episode very soon. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Tomorrow's Tech Today. If you enjoy what we're doing, please subscribe to us and leave a review. It really means a lot. You can also follow us on Twitter and Instagram and see more behind the scenes video footage on YouTube. Thanks for listening.